They taught you to picture slavery through the fields of America. But what if the darkest chapter of the Atlantic slave trade wasn't written in the United States at all? What if the true center of human suffering was a land farther south, where nearly 5 million Africans were dragged ashore in chains, more than any other country on earth? A place where sugar plantations swallowed lives so fast that enslaved people were worked to death and replaced like broken tools. A place where the ocean itself became a graveyard before the ships even reached land. That place was Brazil. The year is 1550. Along the blazing northeastern coast of Portuguese Brazil, the first sugar mills claw their way out of the forest. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and burning cane. Axes crash against ancient trees. Priests bless the colonies. Plantation owners dream of unimaginable wealth. And far out on the Atlantic, a ship moves silently toward shore. Inside it are hundreds of Africans packed so tightly they can barely breathe. Some will never see land. Some pray for death before sunrise. But those who survive are about to enter a machine so cruel that it will transform Brazil into one of the richest empires on earth, while destroying millions of black lives in the process. This is the story history rarely tells. The story of the country that became the largest destination of enslaved Africans in human history. And once you hear what happened in Brazil, you may never look at the history of slavery the same way again. If you believe forgotten history deserves to be remembered, subscribe now to The Lives Chains Couldn't Kill, because the stories buried deepest are often the ones the world was never meant to hear. Over the next 3 centuries, that scene would repeat itself with a frequency and scale that the modern world still struggles to fully comprehend. Between roughly 1501 and 1866, approximately 4.9 million enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to Brazil. That number dwarfs every other destination in the Atlantic slave trade. For context, the United States, the nation whose slave history has dominated the global imagination, received an estimated 388,000 enslaved Africans across the full duration of the transatlantic trade. Brazil received more than 12 times that number. Of every 10 enslaved Africans who crossed the Atlantic, nearly 4 of them arrived in Brazil. The country did not simply participate in the Atlantic slave trade. It was, by every measurable standard, the beating heart of it. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, a scholarly project drawing on ship logs, port records, colonial archives, and insurance documents, has recorded voyages carrying an estimated 10.7 million enslaved Africans who survived the Atlantic crossing to reach the Americas. Brazil's portion of that total, approximately 45% of all survivors, is a number that staggers the conscience. Historians Luiz Felipe de Alan Castro, Herbert Klein, and João José Reis, among others, have spent decades excavating the documentary evidence that makes this accounting possible. Their work reveals that the Brazilian slave trade was not a peripheral feature of the colonial economy. It was the economy. The trade began in earnest in the 1530s and 1540s, when the Portuguese crown distributed the Brazilian coast into hereditary captaincies and began incentivizing sugar production. The northeastern captaincy of Pernambuco and the Recôncavo region around the Bay of All Saints in Bahia became the earliest and most productive sugar zones. Sugar was, in the 16th century, what oil is in the 21st, the commodity that made fortunes, sparked wars, and reorganized the labor of entire continents. The Portuguese had already pioneered sugar production on the Atlantic islands of Madeira and São Tomé using enslaved African labor before the colonization of Brazil, and they brought that model, and those labor systems, across the ocean with them. Initially, the Portuguese colonizers attempted to enslave the indigenous Tupi-speaking peoples of the Brazilian coast. For a brief period, they succeeded. Indigenous Brazilians were forced into the cane fields and the boiling houses where raw cane juice was processed into sugar. But indigenous labor proved, from the perspective of colonial exploitation, unreliable, not because indigenous people were weak or unwilling to resist, but because they resisted effectively. They fled into forests they knew far better than any European. They died in catastrophic numbers from smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases against which they had no immunity. Entire coastal communities were obliterated within decades of contact. The Jesuit priest José de Anchieta, writing in the mid-16th century, documented the devastation of indigenous populations in terms that made clear the scale of demographic collapse. Where tens of thousands had lived, thousands now survived. Where thousands had survived, hundreds remained. The Portuguese turned, as they had already done elsewhere in their Atlantic empire, to West and Central Africa. The enslaved people transported to Brazil were not taken from one place, one culture, or one people. They were drawn from a vast geographic arc stretching from present-day Senegambia in the northwest, through the Gold Coast and the Bight of Benin, down the Bight of Biafra, and deep into Central Africa, the kingdoms of Congo and Ndongo, the peoples of the Angola region, the interior of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. The variety of languages, religions, political structures, and social systems among the people forcibly transported across the Atlantic was as wide as the continent from which they were taken. The largest single-source region for enslaved people sent to Brazil was West Central Africa, present-day Angola, the Republic of Congo, and Western DRC. The historian Joseph Miller, in his monumental work Way of Death, estimated that between 40 and 50% of all enslaved Africans transported to Brazil originated from this region. The second largest source was the Bight of Benin, the coastal stretch corresponding roughly to present-day Benin, Togo, and southwestern Nigeria. From this region came enslaved people predominantly of Fon, Yu, and Yoruba cultural heritage, people whose religions, languages, and social practices would leave extraordinarily deep marks on Brazilian culture. The mechanisms of enslavement in Africa were varied and complex. Contrary to the simplistic image sometimes presented in popular history, European traders did not typically venture into the African interior to capture people. They established coastal trading posts, the Portuguese called theirs feitorias, and they waited for African merchants and political authorities to bring enslaved people to them. The supply of captives depended on African political dynamics, wars between kingdoms, raids on neighboring peoples, judicial systems that sentenced certain categories of offenders to enslavement, and the expansion of commercial networks that transformed human beings into trade goods. The Kingdom of Dahomey, established in the early 17th century in present-day Benin, became one of the most significant suppliers of enslaved people to the Bight of Benin trade, conducting regular military campaigns against neighbors specifically to capture people for sale to European traders. The Aro Confederacy in present-day southeastern Nigeria controlled interior trade networks and supplied large numbers of captives, many of Igbo cultural background, to ports along the Bight of Biafra. In the Angola region, Portuguese colonial authorities worked in shifting alliance and conflict with the Kingdom of Ndongo and later the Kingdom of Matamba, creating conditions of chronic warfare that generated a steady stream of captives. The experience of captivity before reaching the coast was itself a journey of trauma. Historian Stephanie Smallwood in Saltwater Slavery traces the process through which free African persons were transformed into commodities, a process she calls commodification. Captured people were marched, often for weeks or months, from the interior to the coast, sometimes in coffles, groups bound together by the neck or hands. Many died on these marches from exhaustion, dehydration, disease, or violence. Those who survived arrived at the coast already stripped of the social relationships, kin networks, community ties, political identities that gave their lives meaning. At the coast, the enslaved waited in barracoons, holding pens operated by African or mixed heritage merchants, or in the dungeons of European-built slave castles. Elmina Castle on the Gold Coast, built by the Portuguese in 1482 and later seized by the Dutch, held enslaved people in underground chambers where the physical evidence of their confinement, worn stone floors, scratched walls, can still be visited. The wait in these facilities could last weeks, during which the captives were inspected, branded with identifying marks, baptized by Catholic priests, a formality the Portuguese considered sufficient to address the spiritual dimensions of the transaction, and loaded onto ships. The crossing of the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, was the defining horror of the transatlantic slave trade, and the Brazil route had its own particular geography. Ships crossing to Brazil's northeastern ports, particularly Salvador in Bahia and Recife in Pernambuco, traveled a shorter Atlantic route than those heading to the Caribbean or North America. The crossing from Angola to Bahia, a common route, could be accomplished in as few as 35 days under favorable winds. The crossing from ports along the Bight of Benin was similarly shorter than transatlantic routes to northern destinations. This shorter crossing was significant not because it made the journey humane, it did not, but because it affected the patterns of cultural survival among enslaved Africans in Brazil. People transported over shorter distances in larger numbers tended to share cultural and linguistic frameworks more extensively, facilitating cultural retention and community formation in the New World. The conditions aboard the ships themselves were brutal beyond modern imagination. The Brazilian historian Luiz Felipe de Alencastro estimated that, across the full history of the trade, the mortality rate during the Middle Passage to Brazil averaged between 10 and 15%, meaning that somewhere between 500,000 and 1.2 million people died at sea before reaching Brazilian shores. The ships used in the Brazilian trade were often smaller and less well-regulated than those in the British or French trades, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. Captive Africans were packed into holds with minimal headroom, often less than 3 feet, lying on wooden shelves in rows so tight that movement was nearly impossible. The air in the holds became thick with the stench of sweat, excrement, vomit, and the early smell of infection. Dysentery, smallpox, and respiratory illness moved through the holds rapidly. The enslaved were brought on deck periodically, but the experience of deck air was not freedom. It was exposure, surveillance, and the horror of the open ocean with no land in sight and no possibility of return. Resistance happened aboard the ships. Historians David Eltis and David Richardson, analyzing data from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, documented that shipboard revolts or resistance events occurred on approximately 10% of documented slave ship voyages. On Brazil-bound ships, revolts are recorded across multiple centuries. The strategies of resistance varied: collective uprisings, individual acts of defiance, hunger strikes, attempts at self-drowning by people who preferred death to captivity, and, among women, who were sometimes granted slightly more freedom of movement on deck, acts of intelligence gathering and coordination that enabled male captives to rise. For those who survived the crossing and arrived in Brazilian ports, the first sight of the country was not the magnificent Baroque churches of Salvador or the commercial bustle of Recife's harbors. It was the slave market. The slave markets of Salvador, Recife, Rio de Janeiro, and other Brazilian ports were among the largest commercial enterprises in the colonial and imperial economy. In Salvador, the largest market operated near the waterfront, and the purchase of enslaved people was as routine a commercial transaction as the purchase of any other commodity. Enslaved people arriving from ships were inspected by buyers, their teeth examined, their muscles assessed, their bodies turned and probed by strangers determining their monetary value. They were sold in lots and individually, their prices varying with age, sex, apparent health, ethnic origin. Buyers paid premiums for people from certain African regions believed to have particular aptitudes, and the fluctuations of supply and demand. The legal framework that governed this system was built into the structures of Portuguese colonial law. The Ordenacos Filipinas, the legal code in effect in Brazil for much of the colonial period, defined enslaved Africans as property, movable goods, with no legal standing except as objects of ownership. The Catholic Church, despite its formal concern for the souls of the enslaved, never mounted a serious institutional challenge to the legality of Brazilian slavery. Individual clergy, including the 17th century Jesuit Antonio Vieira, delivered famous sermons denouncing the cruelty of slaveholders and urging better treatment of the enslaved, but Vieira, for all his rhetorical power, did not condemn the institution of slavery itself. The Church baptized enslaved people, required their religious instruction, and occasionally interceded in individual cases of extreme abuse. It also owned enslaved people itself and derived income from the institution. Once purchased, enslaved people were distributed across the Brazilian economy. In the northeast, the sugar plantations, the Engenhos, absorbed the majority. In Minas Gerais from the late 17th century, gold and diamond mines consumed tens of thousands of enslaved lives. In Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, coffee plantations beginning in the late 18th century and exploding in the 19th created a new center of slave-based agriculture. In cities, enslaved people worked as domestic servants, artisans, street vendors, porters, and sailors. A particular institution unique to urban Brazilian slavery was the practice of escravos de ganho, enslaved people who were sent out by their owners to earn wages, a portion of which was handed over as rent while the remainder was sometimes retained by the enslaved person themselves. This practice created a complex urban economy in which some enslaved people accumulated small amounts of money and, in some cases, eventually purchased their own freedom. The plantation system, however, was where the most total and systematic violence operated. An engenho, a sugar plantation, was a complete economic unit. It comprised the cane fields, the mill for grinding cane, the boiling house where juice was converted to sugar through a series of increasingly intense heating processes, the distillery for Aguardent, the slave quarters, the master's house, and the chapel. The labor of the enslaved sustained every stage of this process. The working life of an enslaved person on a Brazilian sugar plantation was organized around a logic of maximum extraction with minimum investment. The work of cutting cane was performed during the harvest season, the safra, which could last 6 to 8 months of the year. During safra, the mills ran continuously, day and night. Enslaved workers were organized into shifts and rotations, but the demands of the boiling process, which required constant attention to keep the sugar from burning or losing its crystalline quality, meant that enslaved workers frequently went without sleep for extended periods. The historian Stuart Schwartz, in Sugar Plantations and the Formation of Brazilian Society, documented the working conditions on Bahia-Anhanhos with meticulous detail drawn from plantation records, Inquisition testimony, and travelers' accounts. The boiling house was a particular site of danger. The enormous copper cauldrons of boiling cane juice required constant stirring and ladling, and the proximity to open heat sources meant that burns were common. The grinding mill, where cane stalks were fed between heavy rollers to extract juice, was responsible for a category of injuries so common that plantation managers maintained a routine protocol. If an enslaved worker's hand was caught in the rollers, the recommended response was to immediately sever the arm above the point of entrapment with an axe kept hanging nearby. The alternative was to lose the entire person to the rollers. The axe was not a gesture of mercy. It was a calculation of property management. The mortality rate on Brazilian sugar plantations was, by any modern standard, catastrophic. Historians have debated the precise numbers, but the broad consensus, documented through plantation records and parish death registrations, is that an enslaved population on a Brazilian ingenio could not sustain itself through natural reproduction. Death rates consistently exceeded birth rates, driven by the combination of exhausting labor, inadequate nutrition, disease, violence, and a deliberate policy among many planners of working enslaved people to death rather than investing in their long-term welfare. The calculation, made explicit in some plantation management documents of the period, was straightforward. The cost of a new enslaved person purchased in the market was, during most of the 17th and 18th centuries, low enough that it was economically rational to work an enslaved person to death within 7 to 10 years and replace them. This calculation, that African lives were cheaper to replace than to preserve, was the engine that drove the insatiable Brazilian demand for new captives across 3 centuries. The system of punishment was elaborate, codified, and public. The whip, the chicote, was the primary instrument of discipline, and its use was unrestricted in practice, if not always in law. Plantation owners and overseers administered beatings for virtually any infraction: slow work, perceived insolence, failure to meet production quotas, attempting to rest. The tronco was a wooden device in which the legs of enslaved people were locked, sometimes for days. The palmatoria, a perforated wooden paddle, was used to strike the palms of the hands, producing intense pain without disabling the worker. Branding with hot irons was used both to mark ownership and as punishment. The mutilation of ears, fingers, and other body parts was documented in both plantation records and in Inquisition testimony, which occasionally recorded the complaints of enslaved people who had found access to church oversight mechanisms. Public executions of enslaved people judged to have committed serious offenses, most often violent resistance against overseers or enslavers, were conducted in the same spirit that public executions in European cities were conducted, as theatrical demonstrations of power intended to terrify the living into submission. The legal right of enslavers to inflict violence on enslaved people was essentially unlimited until the late colonial period, and even formal legal restraints introduced in the 19th century, which nominally prohibited excessive punishment without defining what excessive meant, were rarely enforced against planners by colonial and later imperial courts that were themselves composed of slaveholders and their social peers. The Brazilian economy's relationship to enslaved labor was not static. Over 3 centuries, the primary sites of exploitation shifted geographically and by commodity, and each shift created its own particular forms of violence and its own particular conditions of survival and resistance. The sugar northeast, Pernambuco and Bahia, dominated the first 2 centuries of Brazilian slavery, from roughly 1550 to 1700. During this period, Brazil was the world's dominant producer of sugar, and its Anhanhos were the most profitable agricultural enterprises in the Atlantic world. The city of Salvador, capital of colonial Brazil until 1763, was built on the profits of sugar and the labor of enslaved Africans. Its Baroque churches, the Igreja do Nosso Senhor do Bonfim, the Cathedral Basilica, the churches and convents of the historic Pelourinho district, were constructed with funds derived from the slave economy. The Pelourinho itself, the colonial city center that UNESCO declared a World Heritage Site in 1985, takes its name from the word for pillory, the public post to which enslaved people were tied for public punishment. The discovery of gold in the interior region of Minas Gerais in the 1690s transformed the geography of Brazilian slavery. The gold rush of the early 18th century was, in terms of its consumption of human labor, devastating. Historian A.J.R. Russell Wood, in The Black Man in Slavery and Freedom in Colonial Brazil, documented the conditions in the mining districts, where enslaved people worked in open alluvial deposits and in underground shafts panning and digging for gold. The work was dangerous in multiple senses. Physical injury from cave-ins and falls was common. Prolonged immersion in cold water in alluvial panning operations contributed to respiratory illness. The absence of adequate food and rest shortened lives already shortened by brutal labor. The population of Minas Gerais grew with startling speed in the 18th century, from near nothing to over 300,000 people by mid-century, and the majority of this population was enslaved. The colonial city of Vila Rica, now Ouro Preto, became the most opulent city in 18th century Brazil, its churches encrusted with gold leaf hammered and shaped by enslaved and freed African craftsmen. The great Baroque sculptor Antonio Francisco Lisboa, known as Elijah was the son of a Portuguese architect and an enslaved African woman, and his prophets and passion scenes, carved in soapstone on the hillsides of Congonhas do Campo, remain among the supreme achievements of New World art. They were made in a world that treated his mother's people as property. The third great cycle of Brazilian slave labor was coffee. Beginning in the Paraíba Valley north of Rio de Janeiro in the late 18th century, and expanding explosively into São Paulo province in the 19th, coffee transformed the economic geography of the country and created a new southeastern center of plantation slavery. Coffee had one significant difference from sugar. It required less intensive processing labor and therefore created a slightly different working environment. But the field labor of planting, tending, harvesting, and drying coffee was still backbreaking and relentless, and it was still performed primarily by enslaved people. The coffee economy of São Paulo in the 19th century consumed enslaved people transported in large numbers from the depopulating sugar northeast, an internal slave trade that historian Robert Sleens has documented in detail, and it continued to receive newly imported Africans until the illegal trade was finally suppressed in the 1850s. The formal abolition of the Brazilian slave trade was a prolonged, contested, and ultimately hypocritical process. Britain, having abolished its own slave trade in 1807 and slavery throughout its empire in 1833, applied sustained diplomatic and eventually military pressure on Brazil to end the transatlantic trade. Anglo-Brazilian treaties of 1826 and 1831 nominally made the Brazilian slave trade illegal. The Brazilian law of November 7, 1831, known colloquially as the Lei para Ingles Ver, or Law for English Eyes, declared all Africans imported after that date to be legally free. The law was never enforced. Between 1831 and 1850, approximately 750,000 enslaved Africans were illegally imported into Brazil, a number larger than the entire documented slave import history of the United States. Plantation owners, imperial officials, and merchants conspired openly to continue the trade, and the African captives who arrived during this period were simply registered with falsified documentation or registered not at all. The British Royal Navy, authorized by treaty to intercept slavers, conducted patrols along the Brazilian coast and intercepted dozens of slave ships. The accounts of these interceptions, documented in British naval records and in newspaper coverage that reached both London and Rio de Janeiro, are among the most harrowing records of the trade's final decades. A naval surgeon's account from the 1840s, describing the condition of Africans found aboard an intercepted slaver, hundreds of people crammed into a hold designed for cargo, many ill, some dead, others driven to extremity by thirst and fear, captures the calculated dehumanization of the late illegal trade. Brazil's slave trade was finally effectively suppressed in 1850 by the Eusebio de Quiro's law, enacted under direct British pressure and ultimately, because Brazil's own political class recognized that continued flouting of international law was becoming diplomatically and economically untenable. But the suppression of the trade did not end slavery itself. By 1850, Brazil had a domestic enslaved population of approximately 2.5 million people, a population that slave owners intended to exploit indefinitely through natural reproduction and internal commerce. The institution of slavery in Brazil survived the end of the trade by nearly 4 decades. The Lei do Ventre Livre, the Free Womb Law, of 1871 declared that children born to enslaved mothers after that date were legally free, but required them to remain under their mother's enslaver's custody until age 8, and gave enslavers the option of keeping them in service until age 21. The Sexagenarian Law of 1885 nominally freed enslaved people over 60 years of age, a population that, given life expectancy under slavery, was extremely small. These measures were designed not to end slavery but to slow its end, managing the gradual demographic decline of the enslaved population in a way that protected slaveholder interests. It was the Golden Law, Lei Aurea, signed by Princess Regent Isabel on May 13, 1888, that abolished slavery in Brazil. It was the most absolute abolition law in hemispheric history. 2 paragraphs, no compensation to enslavers, no transition period. It was also the last. Brazil was the final country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. The 388 years between the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Brazil and the signing of the Golden Law represent the longest sustained period of African slavery in any single country's history. But numbers and chronologies, however necessary, tell only part of the story. Because the enslaved people of Brazil were not merely victims. They were, simultaneously, the most creative cultural force in the history of the country. In the face of a system designed to strip them of everything, their names, their languages, their families, their religions, their memories, Africans in Brazil preserved, adapted, and ultimately transformed their traditions into something that became inseparable from Brazilian civilization. The preservation of African religious traditions in Brazil is one of the most remarkable stories of cultural survival in world history. The Catholic Church required the baptism of enslaved people and attempted to impose Christian doctrine as a replacement for African spiritual practices. It did not succeed. Enslaved Africans, particularly those from Yoruba-speaking regions of West Africa and from the Kingdom of Congo in Central Africa, developed extraordinary strategies of religious survival. The most successful of these was syncretism, the strategic alignment of African orixas, or divine beings, with Catholic saints. The Yoruba deity Exango, Orisha of thunder and justice, was identified with Saint Barbara. Yemanja, Orisha of the sea, was aligned with Our Lady of the Navigators. Oxum, Orisha of rivers and love, was aligned with Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception. This was not simply disguise. Though it served that protective function, it was a genuine theological and cultural synthesis, a transformation of both traditions in contact with each other. The result was Candomblé, the Afro-Brazilian religion that emerged most fully in Bahia among communities predominantly of Yoruba, called Nego in Brazil, Fon called Gij, and Congo-Angola cultural heritage. Candomblé preserved African languages for ritual use. The liturgical language of Nego Candomblé is a form of Yoruba that Brazilian scholars have recognized as preserving features of 18th century Yoruba not found in contemporary Yoruba dialects in West Africa. The terreiros, the sacred compounds where candomblé is practiced, maintained elaborate systems of knowledge, including the names and characteristics of dozens of orixas, the protocols of ritual possession, the use of specific plants and animals in ceremony, and the complex musical system of rhythms and songs specific to each divine being. All of this was transmitted orally, across generations, under conditions of active suppression by colonial and imperial authorities, who periodically raided terreiros and arrested their leaders. The most important terreiros in Brazilian history were established by African women. The Ilaxai Inaço Oca, known as the Casa Branca do Engenho Velho, in Salvador was founded, according to oral tradition, in the early 19th century by African women who had been enslaved and who established the first formally organized candomblé house of the Ketu, Yoruba nation. Its successive leaders, including the legendary Mãe Menininha do Gantois, who led the Gantois terreiro for 64 years until her death in 1986, became among the most respected and politically significant religious figures in Brazilian history. No account of African life in Brazil is complete without the quilombos, the communities of escaped enslaved people who established free territories throughout the country for 3 centuries. The word Quilombo derives from the Kimbundu language of Angola, where Quilombo referred to a type of military camp or settlement. In Brazil, it became the term for any community formed by Africans who had escaped enslavement. Quilombos ranged from small temporary camps of a handful of fugitives to massive, complex communities with thousands of inhabitants, agricultural systems, political structures, and trading relationships with surrounding populations. The largest and most famous was Palmares, located in the interior of the present-day state of Alagoas in northeastern Brazil. Palmares was not a single settlement, but a confederation of related Quilombo communities. Scholars estimate it contained between 11 and 30,000 inhabitants at its peak in the late 17th century. It persisted for nearly 100 years, from approximately 1600 to 1694, resisting multiple military expeditions sent by both the Dutch, who controlled northeastern Brazil from 1630 to 1654, and the Portuguese colonial administration. The military leader most associated with Palmares' final resistance was Zumbi, a man whose life and death have made him the central figure of Afro-Brazilian historical memory. Born in Palmares around 1655 and captured as a child by Portuguese forces, Zumbi was raised by a Catholic priest and educated in Latin and Portuguese before escaping and returning to Palmares at the age of approximately 15. He rose to become the greatest military commander in the Confederation's history and its final leader. When the Portuguese finally destroyed Palmares in 1694, mobilizing a force that included Bandeirantes, backland raiders from Sao Paulo, under the command of Domingos Jorge Velho, Zumbi escaped but was captured and killed in November 1695. His head was displayed in Recife as a warning. The date of his death, November 20th, is now observed in Brazil as Dia da Consciência Negra, Black Consciousness Day, a national holiday established by law in 2003. The historian João José Reis, in Slave Rebellion in Brazil, documented the long history of Quilombo formation and slave resistance across the country, establishing that the experience of Palmares, however exceptional in scale, was not exceptional in kind. Quilombos existed throughout coastal Bahia, in the forests of Maranhão, in the mining districts of Minas Gerais, in the wetlands of the Pantanal, and on the edges of virtually every major plantation region in the country. The persistence of Quilombos across 3 centuries of active military suppression is testimony to both the determination of the people who formed them and to the inadequacy of colonial and imperial state power to control the vast Brazilian interior. The 1988 Brazilian Constitution, ratified exactly 100 years after the Golden Law, included a provision that communities descended from Quilombos have the right to the permanent titling of the lands they occupy. There are today over 3,000 officially recognized Quilombola communities in Brazil, ranging from large rural territories in Para and Maranhão to small urban neighborhoods in cities like Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo. The largest urban slave revolt in the history of the Americas occurred not in the United States, not in Haiti after independence, but in Salvador, Bahia, Brazil, on January 24th to 25th, 1835. It is known as the Male Revolt, Revolta dos Males, after the Yoruba word for Muslim. The planners and leaders of the revolt were primarily enslaved and freed Africans of the Nego, Yoruba, ethnicity who were Muslim, a consequence of the wave of Islamic revivalism that had swept through Yorubaland and neighboring regions of West Africa in the early 19th century, producing enslaved people who came to Brazil already literate in Arabic and deeply committed to an intellectual and spiritual tradition that offered powerful frameworks for understanding and challenging their enslavement. Historians João José Reis, in Slave Rebellion in Brazil, and Sylvian Diouf, in Servants of Allah, African Muslims enslaved in the Americas, have reconstructed the revolt in extraordinary detail from the records of the trials that followed. The conspirators, who included both enslaved and freed African men, planned to rise on the night of January 24th, the final night of Ramadan, and to strike simultaneously at multiple points across the city of Salvador. Their weapons were crude, knives, swords fashioned from agricultural tools, and an insufficient number of firearms. Their plan required coordination among hundreds of people organized across the city's various neighborhoods. The revolt was betrayed, as most slave revolts were ultimately betrayed, by the informant networks that colonial and imperial authorities cultivated deliberately among enslaved populations. Police moved to suppress the uprising before its full scope could be realized. But when the conspirators realized discovery was imminent, they rose anyway, fighting their way through the streets of Salvador in the early hours of January 25th. Approximately 70 fighters engaged police and militia forces in the Agua dos Meninos neighborhood and other parts of the city. The fighting lasted several hours. At least 70 people died in the uprising itself, including both rebels and their opponents. The repression that followed was swift and comprehensive. Hundreds of people, enslaved and free, were arrested. Courts tried 233 defendants, were executed by firing squad in a public ceremony. Many others were sentenced to flogging, prison, or deportation back to Africa. The slave owners of Bahia were terrified, not merely by the size of the revolt, but by what it revealed about the internal organization, literacy, and determination of the African Muslim community in their midst. In the aftermath, authorities launched a systematic campaign to suppress African Islam and to restrict the movement, assembly, and education of enslaved people. But the male revolt could not be wholly suppressed from historical memory. It became a touchstone for Afro-Brazilian scholars and activists in the 20th century, and Ries's scholarly account of it, first published in Portuguese in 1986 and in English in 1993, established it as one of the defining events in the history of the African diaspora. Of all the cultural legacies of African slavery in Brazil, none is more globally recognized, and none is more thoroughly misunderstood, than the role of African music in the creation of Brazilian musical culture. The music of Brazil is African music transformed by centuries of encounter with European and indigenous American traditions, and no honest accounting of samba, batuque, maracatu, axe music, or even the melancholy longing of the Fado-influenced moda and modinha can omit that genealogy. The batuque, a generic term used by colonial authorities to describe African drum and dance gatherings, was both a cultural practice and a form of resistance. Colonial and imperial authorities periodically banned batuque performances as threats to public order and Christianization. Enslaved people performed them anyway, in slave quarters, in the streets of cities on religious holidays, and in the hidden spaces of plantation life. The drum rhythms of batuque, which varied by African regional tradition, with Angolan, Yoruba, Fon, and other rhythmic systems all represented, were vehicles for communication, for the preservation of ritual knowledge, for the expression of a collective identity that slavery sought to eradicate. The musical tradition that would eventually crystallize as samba emerged from this complex of African rhythmic practices in the urban environment of Rio de Janeiro in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Historians Hermano Viana and Brian McCann have traced the genealogy of samba to the batuques of Bahian migrants who settled in the port neighborhoods of Rio de Janeiro after abolition, bringing with them the rhythmic vocabulary of African Bahia. The earliest documented sambas, including the 1917 recording of Pelo Telephone, conventionally cited as the first recorded samba, emerged from a community of musicians and composers who were predominantly Afro-Brazilian and who drew on a musical heritage rooted directly in the slave experience. Capoeira presents another story of cultural survival through transformation. Capoeira is a martial art, a system of fighting disguised as dance, that emerged in Brazil among enslaved Africans. Its precise origins are debated. Some historians trace it to Angolan traditions of dance and martial practice. Others see it as a Brazilian synthesis of various African combat and movement traditions. What is clear from the historical record is that capoeira was practiced by enslaved people, that it was criminalized by colonial and imperial authorities who recognized its potential as a fighting system, and that it was practiced clandestinely, while being presented as an innocuous pastime when the presence of authorities required the disguise. The swaying, rhythmic quality of capoeira movement, which makes it look, to an uninformed eye, like a fluid dance performance, was functional camouflage. After abolition, capoeira was formally illegal in Brazil until the 1930s. It is now recognized as a UNESCO intangible cultural heritage of humanity. The food of Brazil is, to an extraordinary degree, African food. The ingredients, techniques, and flavor combinations of the Afro-Brazilian kitchen were brought across the Atlantic by enslaved women, who cooked not only for their own communities, but for the households of the enslavisser, introducing African culinary traditions into Brazilian domestic life in ways that permanently shaped the national cuisine. The palm oil known in Brazil as dende, derived from the West African palm Elias guineensis, is the fundamental flavoring of Bahian cooking, and it arrived in Brazil as part of the food system of enslaved West Africans. Dishes like maquica de piques, fish stew, vatapa, a paste of bread, shrimp, peanuts, and dend, caruru, okra with shrimp, onion, and palm oil, acreage, fried black-eyed pea fritters sold on the streets of Salvador by women in traditional white dresses who are practitioners of candomblé. These are African dishes, or dishes directly descended from African culinary traditions, that are now recognized as the foundations of Bahian cuisine and, by extension, of Brazilian national food culture. UNESCO recognized the acreage in 2005 as an intangible cultural heritage. The contribution of African languages to Brazilian Portuguese is pervasive and documented. The linguist Yeda Pessoa de Castro, in decades of scholarly work, identified over 10,000 words of African origin, predominantly Bantu, Kimbundu, Kikongo, and Yoruba, in contemporary Brazilian Portuguese. These words appear not at the margins of the language but at its center, in common everyday vocabulary: cacula for youngest child, molke for boy, dengue originally describing a type of affectation, cachimbo for pipe, gilo for a type of bitter vegetable, quindim for a coconut sweet, in the names of foods and instruments and spiritual beings, in terms of endearment and insult and humor. The Portuguese of Brazil sounds different from the Portuguese of Portugal, partly because it was shaped for 4 centuries by the mouths, tongues, and linguistic habits of millions of African speakers. On May 13, 1888, when Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law, Brazil's enslaved population received no compensation, no land, no educational provisions, no formal mechanism of integration into the civic life of the Republic that would be proclaimed 16 months later. They were free, in the most literal and austere sense, free from the legal status of property, free to starve, free to be homeless, free to compete for labor in a market that had no use for them and no interest in their welfare. The abolition of slavery did not dismantle the racial hierarchy that slavery had created. The pseudoscientific racism of the late 19th century, which circulated throughout the Atlantic world, and which the Brazilian intellectual class absorbed enthusiastically, provided a new framework for the subordination of Afro-Brazilians. The ideology of branqueamento, whitening, promoted by Brazilian elites in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, held that Brazil's future progress required the progressive whitening of its population through European immigration and the gradual biological assimilation of African and indigenous populations. The government subsidized European immigration, predominantly Italian, German, and Spanish, to São Paulo's coffee regions in the 1880s and 1890s, partly to replace the labor of the freed enslaved, and partly to implement the whitening project. The myth of racial democracy, the idea associated most prominently with the sociologist Gilberto Freire in his 1933 work Casa Grande y Senzala, The Masters and the Slaves, held that Brazil had achieved a uniquely harmonious form of racial mixture, free from the rigid color bars of the United States or South Africa. Freire's vision was seductive, influential, and profoundly misleading. He acknowledged the violence of slavery. Indeed, he documented it, but he framed the sexual relations between enslaved women and their enslavers as something other than rape, and he presented Brazilian racial mixture as evidence of a benevolent and flexible Portuguese colonial character. The myth of racial democracy served, for much of the 20th century, to suppress discussion of racial inequality in Brazil by insisting that it did not exist. The reality was different, and it was documented by Brazilian social scientists from the 1950s onward. The sociologist Florestan Fernandes, in A Integração do Negro na Sociedade de Classes, The Integration of the Black Man in Class Society, published in 1965, produced the first systematic empirical study of racial inequality in post-abolition Brazil, demonstrating that Afro-Brazilians remained at the bottom of virtually every measurable indicator of social welfare: income, education, health, housing, and life expectancy. His work was suppressed under the military dictatorship that governed Brazil from 1964 to 1985, but its arguments have been vindicated by every subsequent generation of research. The Afro-Brazilian movement, the Movimento Negro, has since the 1970s waged a sustained political campaign for racial recognition and racial justice. Its achievements include the establishment of Black Consciousness Day as a national holiday, the passage of the Statute of Racial Equality in 2010, the implementation of racial quotas in public universities beginning in the 2000s, and the official recognition of Quilombola land rights. But structural racial inequality in Brazil remains profound. In the data compiled by the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, IBG, in the 2010s and 2020s, Afro-Brazilians, Pretos and Pardos, who together constitute more than half the population, earn on average approximately 57% of what white Brazilians earn. They are disproportionately represented among murder victims. In a country with one of the highest homicide rates in the world, black men between 15 and 29 years of age are killed at rates that have led researchers to describe a situation of ongoing racial massacre. They are underrepresented in universities, in the professions, in the judiciary, in parliament, and in the cultural institutions that define national prestige. Historians speak sometimes of the dead as statistics, and there is no way around the fact that the scale of Brazilian slavery must be understood quantitatively if it is to be understood at all. But statistics are made of people, and the people of whom these statistics are made deserve to be seen as people. There was a woman, unnamed in the historical record, her name swallowed by the system that denied her the right to have one, who was taken from somewhere in Yorubaland, perhaps from near the city of Oyo, perhaps from a smaller town in its orbit, in the 1790s or 1800s. She was marched to a coastal port, held in a barracoon, placed on a ship, and transported across the Atlantic to the port of Salvador. She was sold in the Valongo market or one of its equivalents, purchased by an ingenio owner in the Reconcavo, and put to work cutting cane. She kept, somewhere in her memory, the songs and the prayers and the names of Orixas that she had learned before captivity. She passed them, in whatever fragments she could, to the children she bore in Brazil, children who may or may not have been taken from her and sold elsewhere. She died probably young, probably of exhaustion or illness or violence, and was buried without ceremony. She has no grave that can be visited, no name that can be spoken. What she left behind, what she and the millions of others like her left behind, is everything that Brazil calls its own in the domains of music, religion, food, language, movement, and spirit. The samba that the world dances is hers. The orixas that fill the terreiros of Salvador and Sao Paulo are hers. The acreage that a woman in white sells on the street corner at the foot of the elevator Lacerda in Salvador on a Tuesday morning is hers. The word molque that a Brazilian uses without thinking to address a young boy is hers. Brazil built the largest slave society in the history of the Americas. It imported nearly 5 million human beings from Africa under conditions of terror and degradation that lasted 3.5 centuries. It was the last country in the Western world to abolish the institution. It has never fully reckoned with what it did, and the consequences of what it did remain visible in the inequality, the violence, and the unfinished democracy of the present day. But it is also true, and it must be said with equal force, that the people subjected to this system were not destroyed by it. They endured. They resisted. They preserved. They created. They transformed the country that enslaved them so completely that Brazil without Africa is unimaginable, not merely culturally diminished, but literally inconceivable. There is no Brazilian Portuguese without African language. There is no Bahian food without African ingredients and technique. There is no carnival without the drums whose ancestors crossed the Atlantic in the holds of ships. There is no Brazilian Christianity without the orixas that live inside it. The history of Brazil's enslaved Africans is a history of loss, so immense it strains language to contain it. It is also a history of survival so determined, so creative, and so consequential that it must be recognized as one of the great achievements of the human spirit. Both of these things are true simultaneously. They must be held simultaneously. This is not a hidden history in the sense of being unknown. The scholars who have documented it are many, and the evidence is vast. It is hidden in the sense that the country it shaped has not yet fully faced it, has not built the memorials, enacted the reparations, reformed the institutions, or changed the material conditions that would constitute a genuine reckoning. Until Brazil faces, in full, the weight of what happened on those ships and those plantations and in those markets, the full weight of 4.9 million people, it will remain, in some fundamental sense, a country built on a foundation it refuses to examine. The enslaved Africans who built Brazil deserve better than that. So do the descendants who carry their legacy and their blood and their names, or the names that were given when the original names were stolen, in the country that is theirs as much as anyone's. For more than 3 centuries, the machinery of slavery turned Brazil into an empire built on stolen lives. Millions of Africans were torn from their homes, forced across an ocean of death, and swallowed into plantations, mines, and cities that profited from their suffering. But even after chains, whips, and laws tried to erase them, they survived. Their languages survived. Their faith survived. Their music, resistance, and bloodlines survived. And today, the legacy of those Africans still beats through Brazil itself, in its culture, its people, its rhythm, and its history. Because slavery did not only leave scars, it also left survivors. The world remembers the empires that grew rich, but we must also remember the millions whose names were never written down, whose stories were buried beneath sugar fields and silence. If this story moved you, don't let it disappear into history again. Like this video, share it with someone who has never heard this side of the slave trade, and subscribe to the Lives Chains Couldn't Kill for more forgotten stories the world tried to erase. Because history changes when the silenced are finally heard.